Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland. She is one of my personal heroes, and because I think you should always believe everything you read in the Financial Times, I'm pleased to remind you that in 2004, when we put together a list of the most influential Europeans in the past 25 years, Dr. Brundtland was at number 4. The only people she was behind were the Pope, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Margaret Thatcher. So I think that's a pretty good ranking. I am so happy that we have a chance to listen to her today because she is a pioneer in so many areas that are so important to us right now. She is a pioneering feminist politician. She was the Prime Minister of Norway, of course, for 10 years, the first woman Prime Minister of that country. She's also a pioneering public health leader. She is actually a doctor, so if I find myself fading, I know that afterwards I can get some treatment, and has been very important in pursuing issues of public health around the world, including taking a really leading role in the campaign against smoking at a time when that wasn't as fashionable or widely accepted as it is today. She's also a leading environmentalist and was appointed Special Envoy for Climate Change by the UN Secretary-General last year. And then the final thing that I'd like to tell you about Dr. Brundtland, which I thought was really pleasing, is she is a member of a wonderful group called the Elders. This includes other venerable and wise people like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter. And they get together. She's told me they're very active. They get together a lot. I think especially at a gathering like this one, where, of course, technology tends to throw up youth and new ideas, and that is wonderful. I think we should remember that there is a real place for us to listen to the wisdom of our elders, which is what we have the real privilege to do for the next half hour. Dr. Brundtland is going to speak for 5 minutes from the podium, and then I'm going to ask her questions, and then you'll get a chance to do that too.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, some of the old thoughts, even if they are only 25 years old, are very important today. So I thought I would focus on climate change, because we have the whole morning been discussing other issues, and it hasn't been really touched at all. It's real, and it means that the world has to come together to protect planet Earth and the rights, the human rights, and the future of coming generations. I think we all know that. The question is, will we be able to do it in time? And that presupposes collaboration of a greater dimension than what we have been able to do until now. And it was last December in Bali, just barely possible to get the negotiations on climate change going. Why? Because the difference of opinion between different kinds of countries were so great. But the commitments for change now have to drive us forward together. We need the US, we need the rest of the OECD, we need India, China, Brazil, and the really poor countries of the world working together on this. Now, it's a crucial issue of survival, and let me say, we need to get below a 2-degree increase Celsius before 2050. Otherwise, we will all have a big challenge. Now, this is possible. 60% reduction before 2050 will get us there. At the moment, the trends are going upwards. So we really need change. And it means, frankly, decarbonizing the energy sector. And I say that coming from an oil-exporting country where 51% of Norwegian exports are from the petroleum sector today. We have to have a price on carbon that drives change, because the energy and climate mix is a real one. And we have to have energy, electricity, to African poor countries. We heard this morning, it's not there. Big parts of India, no electricity available. So the need to grow will be there in parallel with the dimension of change that can make this possible for poor countries and rich countries alike. Now, I say, is it possible to make change? Well, I have been through some interesting stories that I will share with you briefly. Back in 1990, we were on the road to Rio. We had delivered our common future in London, 1987. We were going on to 5 years after the report that I headed at that time to have the world come together in Rio for change. And in fact, the climate convention was signed in Rio. And that's, in historic terms, quite sensational that it was possible. But we are still struggling with the follow-up. Now, we introduced carbon tax on the Norwegian continental shelf in 1990. There was an outcry, not only in Norway, but around the world from every oil-exporting country. How could this prime minister make a policy that would undermine the future of the petroleum sector in her own country? That was the issue. What is the situation? Well, I told you about the 51%. It is also 26% today of our GDP is the petroleum sector. 36% of the state income is from the petroleum sector. So although we issued the carbon tax, Norwegian petroleum industry is competitive, it's working, and it has the lowest emissions worldwide. Now, that is for me also very important. 1/3 of the world average is what the Norwegian sector emits. 1/2 for what is in Denmark and England. And that makes a difference to the emissions. And lastly, carbon capture and storage is necessary because coal will continue to be used in the next century. Even if we are able to save energy, have renewables, it will happen. So one coal-fired plant that my prime minister visited a couple of weeks ago in South Africa emits more than the whole of Norway emits, including its petroleum sector. To me, it's a shocking illustration of how important it is that we don't lose pace and that we put a price on carbon and that some of that money is used to get down emissions from the emerging economies. Thank you.
Well, I expected Dr. Brundtland to give us something not just to think about, but as Gordon Brown said, to give a speech that made us think, I will march, and that's what I really feel we ought to be doing now. I do want to ask you, though, is it realistic for us to expect the emerging market economies to sacrifice development for the sake of the global environment? Can we ask them to do that?
They don't have to. They don't have to. If we do the right thing and have an agreement in 2009 in Copenhagen, we can make it possible for much quicker change to improve technologies in those countries while they invest. Instead of investing in old types polluting technologies, we have to pay part of that price to make it happen much more quickly. In India, in China, in South Africa. I mean, this plant, Norway and other countries can help change much more quickly than South Africa could do on its own.
And that won't be too expensive? That won't end up being a brake on growth for the emerging markets?
No, I don't think so. The question is, will the richer countries be ready to deliver what is necessary to prevent the world from getting much more global warming than what we can tolerate?
So you think the ball is really in the court of the richer countries right now?
A lot. In my mind, we have a US election this year. We are all hoping, and we know that all of the three candidates are saying they have another policy for climate and global warming than what President Bush has been advocating.
Was John McCain's speech significant? Does that mean we'll definitely see a new US policy after November?
I think we will definitely see a change. As we heard this morning from Lehman Brothers also, that she believes the change will be to the benefit of the world, whether it's one or the other candidate.
What is that going to mean in our lives? What are we going to have to do? How much are we going to have to sacrifice as the citizens of these richer countries?
Well, obviously there needs to be changes in the tax composition in countries that are even subsidizing oil and gasoline today. I mean, this is impossible in a long-term view of sustainable development, to subsidize what you need to get down the use of. You don't do that. So that has to change, but that doesn't have to mean that the total tax level has to increase. You can change the way that the tax composition is. Now, when we have a carbon tax in Norway, that money, of course, is part of the public income. And you don't have to have all other taxes up. So it's a question of how you use economic incentives and disincentives so that you stimulate what's good and you disincentivize what's not so good. This can be done.
At a time when energy prices are already so high and imposing such a burden on so many people and so many parts of the economy, is it realistic to talk about adding even more tax onto energy?
Well, we don't know how the oil price will develop, of course. But in Europe and in my country, the tax level continues to be high, even if the oil price goes up. So people have to pay, 3 times more than they do in the US for gasoline in my country, or nearly 2.5 to 3 times as much. This has
even though they produce so much energy themselves.
Yeah, that doesn't make a difference. This is a global market, and the question is, what's wise in order to influence consumption?
Do you think that from the point of view of your concern about the environment, the high price of oil could actually be an advantage?
Yes, the price of oil had a big jump 20 years ago, and what happened was a lot of investment into renewable energy happened. Then as the oil price fell again, down to $10, much of that fell down. Meanwhile, the world needed renewables. We needed to have energy efficiency. It just didn't happen until the last few years again, where people realize it's coming. So now we again see increasing investment in these areas, but we lost a lot of time by this naivete that because it came down to $10, now oil was cheap, it doesn't matter anymore. That was wrong.
Drive our SUVs.
And it was, yeah.
We're in a room full of technologists. To what extent do you think technology will be the solution?
Well, I mean, what I'm saying really is that, why did we get 1/3 of the emissions compared to global average in Norway? It was because of introducing new and improved technology. Use of technology to drive down emissions. And this is going to happen in other cases as well. Technology is crucial.
So you think there's a business opportunity there?
Oh, definitely. And, many business people today are aware. They know that what they want is rules of the game for the global community, so that they have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system that makes it possible, and to know that the governments have agreed for a long-term approach, because then they can invest in the new energy systems.
Does the U.S. risk falling behind in this race to develop environmental technologies because it lacks those sorts of systems?
They risk it, but I think there are many Americans who are aware and are pushing their government to change. There are, as you know, states that have introduced much stricter regulations, like Schwarzenegger has done in California, and other states are following. So, to the extent that there is an old-fashioned policy at the federal level in the U.S., the time is running out for that. The U.S. will come in time, I hope, for 2009.
In a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to ask some questions, and I hope you will rise to the occasion this time. So I'm giving you a warning. So think of your questions. Please start lining up at the mics, and I'll ask a few more questions now while you're thinking. A lot of people talk about the curse of oil, and particularly today when oil prices are so high, we see this perverse fact that countries endowed with natural resources find that those resources have a very damaging impact on the political and even economic development. How has Norway avoided that?
It was important for Norway back in the early 70s when we started our oil era that we had seen what happened in Netherlands. It was at that time called the Dutch disease. They had been taking out their petroleum resources on their continental shelf, using it to build up the public budget without a long-term thinking about what happens when those resources are gone or going down. So we had a policy from the beginning to see that we had a consistent approach, a moderate pace of development that would be able to be absorbed within the Norwegian economy. And then as we came further, the petroleum fund, the sovereign wealth fund, which we have today, $375 billion or more dollars, has been saved to avoid the Norwegian economy getting into inflation and difficulty. And we have succeeded in doing this in a very, systematic approach, and also getting sufficient support across the party lines for a long-term policy.
Do you think your sovereign wealth fund and the way it's run can be an example for some of the other petro-states?
I certainly do. I think it is well conceived, well run, and
are the returns high enough?
Well, it is, the calculation is a real net return of 4%. And we never use more than that into the budget each year. So we are only using the real net return, which is why we can protect the rest of the Norwegian economy from getting into problems.
Okay, I'm going to ask Dr. Brundtland one more question, so get ready to do your part. You're a pioneering woman in national politics, in global politics, and Norway now has taken actual legislative action to get more women on boards. Is that what it's going to take to have a stronger female voice in the corporate world? Should other European countries follow suit?
It is interesting because this happened by a conservative minister who shocked his own party, but he had already declared himself, and the majority in the Norwegian parliament, including the Labour Party, of course, went behind him immediately. But it was interesting because it came as a surprise at that moment. We had been thinking about what to do, to improve the situation in the corporate world, because in the public sector, in the municipalities, all over, we have rules. But we didn't have the same kind of rules in the corporate sector. And people were somewhat shocked. Some of the business people were shocked. But most of them are now following up.
Do you think it's worked?
I think it is working. But, we are still not completely there. But obviously, there are sufficient numbers of women experienced enough gradually that they can get that goal of 40% women in the boards. So it's happening. And of course, it would never have happened as quickly unless that rule had been introduced by a conservative minister, which I'm happy to say because I know that he really took a risk in announcing that kind of policy.
Okay. Any more questions? Thank you, Luis.
Luis Furlan from Brazil. I have two questions. One is, what is your position related to the existing forests that are not able today to trade carbon credits due to the Kyoto Protocol?
Yeah.
And
because
I know that is moving,
yeah,
but not at all. So the non-deforestation could generate carbon credits in order to have a sustainable environment.
The world was not able, when they were dealing with Kyoto, to take on board also the tropical forest complexity. But of course, it belongs there. 20% of the climate problem is linked to the tropical forest and their future. So now, this time, it has to be part of the solution. And Norway's prime minister announced in Bali several billion Norwegian crowns directly thinking of the tropical forest. So we are trying with Brazil and other countries now, Indonesia, etc., to make projects that can inspire the negotiations, because we need also a solution for the tropical forests, which are based on commitments across the world.
You had a second question, Luis?
Yeah, the second question is related to renewable fuels or renewable energy. It's a kind of paradox that most of the oil traded worldwide is duty-free in terms of import levies. You can bring oil from the Middle East and get in the country without import duties. But for renewable fuels, there is an entrance barrier. For instance, ethanol to get in from sugarcane, to get into the US market, need to pay 54 cents per gallon. Yeah. And even in Europe, we need to pay, or Japan. So what will be the outcome? Renewable energy, a lot of taxes. No fossil energy, no taxes for import duties.
I mean, you know, as we heard Gordon Brown this morning talking about protectionism and his view of open economies and avoiding protectionism, I mean, many of these things are part of a bigger global picture of trade negotiations, and they haven't succeeded this round, as you know, over years to get to a conclusion, because many of these things are really linked to trade barriers, to protectionism, and to historical situations. And much of it, you know, needs to open up in a better agreement across the world also on trade. Because there are many strange issues which have to do with national decision-making and historical situations, and they gradually, you know, need to become different. It's now with regard to.
Do you share Gordon Brown's concern that we're moving into a more protectionist period?
Yes, I do. I do share that concern, but I do think that part of the answer, it's not only speaking out for globalization, which he did, but it is also making people feel that their security, you know, in somehow will be taken care of. There are social issues involved that have to do with policies, national policies, and also collaboration to overcome poverty and to increase the social development pattern in such a way that people feel more secure. Because that is part of the answer, you know. You can't just tell people you should love globalization if they can point to some of the consequences and you don't have an answer, negative, and you don't have a good answer to them. So I think that is part of the debate here, which we haven't covered so much.
Take another question.
Dr. Brundtland, Craig Davis from WPP. I was in Norway about 6 weeks ago in Tromsø and went to buy a book at the airport. It's a small airport, as you know. And there were 3 books there that I bought, which surprised me. One was called Enough, one was called Bonfire of the Brands, and the other one was called Affluenza. And they're all books that touch on the same theme, essentially, which is how much stuff is enough for all of us. To what extent do you think that we need to disengage from consumerism, and do you think that that is any part of the answer in terms of energy control, consumption, and ultimately managing change?
Well, I certainly do think it's part of the answer, but in order to have that happen, you have to mobilize people's concerns about the long-term consequences of not being willing to change, or not getting politicians who will help the frameworks to change in such a way that it can inspire a less, polluting or less consumerist approach in the areas where that is negative. I mean, it's not bad in any way that consumers link to the internet around the world. We all have spoken about that. But it is the question of the impact on the environment of many of our actions. But we need politicians and also collaboration across borders that can help this happen. It's not enough for each one to take responsibility, I think. You have to have policies to inspire such change.
Wouldn't politicians be worried about the risk to economic growth? I mean, the US government is handing out $600 checks to get people to go out to the stores and buy more of this stuff.
Well, I mean, at this point, they are scared of a real downturn in the economy. I mean, that's an issue which is a little different, I think, from what they would regularly do.
Yeah. One more question?
Yes, I'm Mr. Kramer from France, and I was surprised that you spoke about climate change for a few minutes, I mean for more than a few minutes, and you didn't mention nuclear energy. As you say, as you know, in France, 80% of electricity comes from nuclear, so that's why French people mostly are in favor of this, and you didn't mention it as a solution, although I thought that it was maybe the only viable, immediately applicable solution to climate change.
What I said is we need to decarbonize the energy sector. And within that, nuclear energy is one type of energy which isn't run on carbon and doesn't emit CO2. And I'm not surprised the question comes from France, you know. But the other issue is, I mean, Norway is now exporting 15% of the European gas. It also illustrates, you know, the dynamics of different energy sources, and you have to have a mix which goes and gives a reasonable solution. I don't think it would be a good idea for every country to start using nuclear energy at this point. I really don't. We need to have wind, solar, a number of others. But those countries that already have the infrastructure, who already have nuclear power, you know, they should continue.
Should we build new reactors in countries that don't? Should they start building new reactors?
There is no energy source except solar that has no environmental or risk downside. Even nuclear energy has. There are risks involved. I just saw, you know, the film again from Chernobyl, and my goodness, I mean, the moment you have something like that in France or any Western European country, we are really getting into trouble. So it's not that simple that, you know, it's perfect, there's no problem.
Sorry, but are you suggesting that French nuclear energy is as dangerous as Chernobyl?
No, I didn't, and nobody thought I did.
But that's been
nobody thought I did, no.
But that's been going on for years, that people are scaring everybody with
Look,
Chernobyl. Either we think it's like
Are
Chernobyl
you aware of the
and
Harrisburg situation in the US? Also, I happen to have seen this Chernobyl just now, but it's not the only nuclear accident we have seen. Sorry.
Okay, I asked for an active discussion with the audience, and I'm glad to get what I asked for. We'll take one final question.
Hello, my name is Hans-Peter Ketter from BMW in Germany, and you will not wonder that this question comes from me, because in Europe we have a lot of discussion now about advertising regulation and car advertising. And I wonder if, for you, this is the right way to deal with the problem of the environmental thing we have now.
Now, what problem are you really addressing then?
At this point, I'm addressing the point of free speech, you know, and that we have probably a regulation of the car advertising in Germany and the whole of Europe.
Well, I'm sorry, if there is a German proposal for this, or a European Commission one, I'm not aware of it. But I think advertising, you know, it's okay to have regulations that advertising should say something about the use of energy, or something about the safety, or something, you know, that kind of regulation I think is acceptable in a world where you need to take many things into consideration. But I'm sorry, I don't know the exact debate that is going on.
I think the discussion at this point of time is that you have, if you have a one-sided spread, that you have 1/3 of the side, the place you have to use to talk about the CO2 emissions of the car and so on.
Yeah, well, I think it's quite a good idea, frankly. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, I think we should all... I knew that we would have a very frank and sharp discussion with Dr. Brundtland, and she hasn't disappointed us, and neither have you. I think that it's particularly wonderful to have one of our elders talking about an issue which, at least in my own household, it's the very youngest members who are the most intensely environmental. Yeah. So maybe we have an intergenerational change in our consciousness about this issue. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Brundtland.
Thank you.